Hi, welcome to Social Work 4110H, Trauma and Addiction. I'm your instructor, Anita Charlson Tucci. This week, we're focusing on cultural resilience and rebuilding the circle. So when we start to explore cultural resilience, it's important for us to have an understanding of culture and cultural evolution. So Rayanne Eisler identifies two models of social organization, each with its own characteristic system configuration of mutually reinforcing parts and cognitive cultural maps that organize and interpret information to fit each system's maintenance needs. Essentially, what this is saying is that each model has a way of maintaining the system. These models of social organization are the dominator and the partnership models. The dominator model is based on the organizational principle of ranking, and the pyramid or triangle is a good representation of what that looks like. This is a way of structuring all social institutions from family, religion, and education to science, politics, and economics, so that one type of human is more highly valued than another. The values within this dominator system are competition, sameness, the ends justifies the means, male dominance, zero-sum model, meaning that everything in the world has a definite end. So if someone gets what I want, then I won't be able to have it because it's gone now. There's also selfism or individualism, aggression, exploitation, isolation, the hierarchy, and the artificial scarcity model, which basically pushes the belief that there's not enough to go around. And so if there's not enough to go around, then I'm going to take it from myself before anyone else does, even at the cost of someone else's well-being. The dominator values in action. So what this system looks like is authoritarian and inequitable social and economic structures. There's the subordination of women and femininity to men and masculinity. There's a high degree of abuse and violence. And there's a push for beliefs and stories that justify and idolize domination and violence. The primary organizational principle for the partnership model is linking. So that is more about relationship. Here, both sexes tend to be valued equally. The distinctive feature of this model is a way of structuring human relations, be they men and women or different races, religions, or nations, in which diversity is not equated with inferiority or superiority. The focus of this model reflects the power to give life, to nurture life, to illuminate life. The partnership values include equality, interconnectedness, cooperation, sharing, respect for roles performed, respect for gender differences and roles, a reverence for life, mutual need, a peaceful existence, compassion, relationships, and hierarchy. And hierarchy is an equality. So a good representation of what a hierarchy system looks like is the circle. So everybody is on the same level and equal. Does this system look like? Well, there's a democratic and economically equatable structure, equal valuing of males and females, and high regard for stereotypical feminine values. There's a mutual respect and trust with low degree of violence. And there's a push for the beliefs and stories that give high value to empathetic and caring relations. Each model maintains particular cognitive maps for organizing perception, thought, feeling, and action, which are embedded within and guide social process in actual social systems. So each system has a way of maintaining the system. And what I have to represent the evolution of social organization is this bead timeline. I was introduced to this bead timeline from a colleague who learned it from a woman by the name of Suzanne Camp. Suzanne Camp is a teacher in the Courtney School District on Vancouver Island. And she created this bead timeline. But I keep my bead timeline in this little box here. She created this bead timeline as a tool to teach the children she works with about Indigenous people and Indigenous way of life in Canada. And so you can see that this bead timeline is very long. The length of this bead represents 10,000 years. And the reason why it represents 10,000 years is because at the time she created this bead timeline, that was the oldest archaeological site in British Columbia. So they found evidence of Indigenous settlement that is 10,000 years old. If you look at the bead timeline, you can see that there are a number of beads. So each of these beads, the small bead represents 20 years. So this whole color of light blue beads represents 100 years. So each bead represents 20 years and each bead represents one generation. So we have different colors to demonstrate every 100 years. So all the way down, that goes to 10,000 years. This is the oldest, actually, since this bead timeline was created, an older site has been discovered, and that site was discovered in the Haltzik territory, the area around Bella Bella. And the age of that site goes back to 15,000 years. So you can imagine adding 5,000 more years to this. So if you look on this bead timeline, this bead represents the time that the pyramids were built in Egypt. This bead represents the start of our calendar year. And this bead represents the time that Rayanne Eisler found that societies began to change. So it was around this time, 5,500 years ago, that societies started to change from partnership societies to dominator societies. And she was finding evidence of this in archaeology and the other disciplines that she studied. So, you know, the reason why that's significant is because I want you to see, again, the length of this timeline. This is around the time when societies began to change. So prior to that, societies in Europe were partnership. That started to change 5,500 years ago. This little red flag represents the age that Canada is. So that's, 150 plus years. That's quite significant, so when I think of this bead timeline, what that demonstrates and what that tells me is that our communities, our Indigenous communities in Canada, have only recently been impacted by the dominator values, the dominator systems. So we are still so closely connected to the partnership way of life. And, that's evident in the traditional values that are held in our communities, that the traditional values that we practice. So that's the bead timeline. And, it's important for me when I think about this bead timeline, something else that really resonates is that no matter who we are or where we're from, we are all connected to the partnership way of life. Even if it was thousands of years ago, it's still there. So reflecting on culture, culture is an expression of worldview, values, and beliefs. Culture comprises the values, norms, rules, and way of life that we get from the generations before us, and how every new generation interprets and adapts these to their own lives and society. Cultural resilience is the capability of a cultural system consisting of cultural processes and relevant communities to absorb adversity, deal with change, and continue to develop. Cultural resilience thus implies both continuity and change. Disturbances that can be absorbed are not an enemy to be avoided, but a partner in the dance of cultural sustainability. One of the things that I truly believe is that culture is alive. And, I really appreciate this definition of cultural resilience because it kind of captures that sense of how culture is dynamic and changing, moving. So reflecting on Indigenous cultures, it's important to acknowledge that there are some shared similarities. And there are also some differences in language, practice, ritual, ceremony, land, acceleration, and colonial contexts. There's a diversity in personal experience. And what that highlights is that everybody's experience is different. So I know in my life, I wasn't raised up in the culture. I was introduced here and there throughout my life, whereas someone else might have been raised up in the culture, or there might be others who were disconnected, dislocated from their land and culture. So there's a diverse range. There are differences in community health and well-being. As social workers supporting Indigenous communities, it's important for us to have an understanding not only of cultural resilience, but also, what cultural resilience means is to be able to utilize Indigenous ways of healing. So Indigenous healing needs to incorporate an understanding and knowledge of Indigenous worldview. Healing must encompass how individuals are situated among their family, community, nation, and all of creation. Indigenous healing requires the development of precise, culturally based trauma theory and interventions rooted in Indigenous worldview, values, and beliefs. Indigenous traditional cultural interventions are a holistic approach to treatment, a way of seeing, a way of relating, a way of thinking, a way of being. Indigenous cultures contain many strategies to help those who've been traumatized. Culture is medicine, and ceremony offers a multimodal approach to healing. So the image that you see on screen is a ceremony that was created by actually a couple of my elders, late Joe Tom and late Ray Seacher. The cedar hoop is something that was brought forward from tradition. And what I really appreciated about my elders is that they found ways to adapt the ceremony so that it could be used in community, not only within particular families, but for anybody who wants to participate. And so this hoop ceremony with the cedar boughs is a way of cleansing and a way of letting go and moving forward. Culture is medicine, and ceremony offers a multimodal approach to healing. Cultural interventions provide hope for our future, grounded in the sense of identity and a belief in spirit. They provide a sense of belonging and connectedness within our families, our community, and our culture. They provide a sense of meaning in our lives and that our communities are part of creation and have rich history. They provide purpose, whether through education, employment, or cultural ways of being and doing. Individuals who remain well connected to their community through group events, gatherings, feasts, ceremonies, and their family and the land may be less likely to engage in risky substance use and therefore face fewer secondary risks. The picture that you see on the screen is a picture that a relative of mine took during a celebration of life potluck that my grandparents hosted. My grandparents at the time wanted to gather with family and community to share and celebrate in their lives. So my grandparents are Pat Charlson and late Mamie Charlson. When I reflect on this time, I just remember the sense of unity and togetherness that I felt with my sisters, my brothers, my parents, my grandparents, and all of the other communities that came to share their songs and dances. Before the potlatch even happened, our family was preparing. We practiced for a whole year prior to the party. So all of these values, hope, belonging, meaning, purpose, were all a part of my experience in this celebration of life potlatch, from preparation to the day that we sang and danced. And I can't stress enough about how strong the sense of spirit, connection to spirit was on this day. Just reflecting on it, I feel so blessed. McCormick demonstrates that connecting people to culture and ceremony is an effective way to facilitate healing. Ceremonies and cultural rituals orient First Peoples to a strength-based worldview. Ceremonial treatment methods are the most powerful. Ceremony allows for the expression of emotions, helps to create a sense of belonging, strengthens our circle of support and community, and is a way to acknowledge various life stages. So the celebration of life potlatch that my grandparents hosted was a way for them to acknowledge their stage in life. They both understood and knew that their time in our physical realm was, coming to an end. And before their times came, they wanted to celebrate with family and community. And it was just beautiful. The body of research which exists powerfully suggests that enculturation and cultural continuity facilitate better overall wellness, well-being, and mental health, and act as important buffers and protective factors against signs of mental health distress, such as substance abuse and suicide. Helpers who are able to incorporate the healing ways of Indigenous cultures have the opportunity to create a new effective theory and practice built on an Indigenous paradigm. Helpers must understand Indigenous culture and integrate Indigenous healing methods, which can be integrated into practice directly or through referrals to appropriate cultural resources such as elders or traditional healers. So it's important for us in the work that we're doing with individuals, families, and communities to be able to support them by offering connection to culture, cultural ceremony, cultural ritual. Non-Indigenous helpers must develop their personal sense of humanism. This means to relate to one another on a human level and to treat others with utmost respect and care. When you respect others as human beings, you honor who they are. You honor their story. You can relate to one another on a mutual level that is meaningful and healing for both the client and practitioner. Cultural and spiritual practices are diverse and vary depending on particular tribe, values, family, beliefs, and customs. So some of the modalities for cultural healing are connection to elders, the use of food. When I think about food, one memory really resonates, and it's a recent memory. In the summertime, I went berry picking with my daughters and we came across thimbleberries. And so I went to pick the thimbleberry and it was a big, bright red thimbleberry. I put it in my mouth and it was the first time that I ever felt that my spirit woke up from eating. And, that was a pretty meaningful, powerful moment for me. And so when I think about food as a cultural modality for healing, I totally understand what that means. So food is medicine too. Dreams, cultural instruments like drums, rattles, talking stick, ceremony, storytelling, medicines, connection to creator and our ancestors through prayer, art, and creativity. So these are some modalities that we can connect with when it comes to cultural healing. It is important to emphasize that the ceremony is a part of the process of healing and not an end. Our old ones knew that and honored the cycles of seasons and what we now know as triggers. Those that do not understand may, without intent, increase shame, suppression, and guilt. So when it comes to healing, especially when we talk about trauma, it's important for us to know that we cannot do the work with ceremony alone. One of the teachings that I heard from Jane is that For many of us, the traumas that we've experienced are directly or indirectly connected to the impacts of colonization. The pain that we experienced must also be healed through healing methods passed on through colonization. So that's bridging both worlds. So we can't do the healing with ceremony alone. We have to incorporate other ways and new ways. Bridging both worlds. The Western worldview and paradigm is valid in its own right and has developed Western therapy that meets the needs of those who view the world from the same lens. Indigenous people are immersed in both Western and Indigenous ways of knowing and being. So we have to be able to offer support that bridges both worlds. While research indicates that Indigenous people have a strong interest in traditional healing, evidence also suggests an even split between First Nations clients who prefer culture-based treatment services and those who do not. So it's important for us to clarify expectations concerning cultural practices and protocols with those you are working with. So that's really important for us to ask the person or ask the family, ask the community that you're working with what fits for them. We must also acknowledge the reality of Indigenous people living in two worlds and therefore consider using a hybrid approach. A hybrid approach utilizes the best healing approaches of both worlds and can facilitate the process of liberation and healing. In the work that I do, the cultural work that I do, oftentimes I'm called upon to help with doing spiritual cleansings. So what I've learned to do is utilize cultural tradition and somatic experiencing in that particular ceremony. So there are ways to bring them together. And I want to finish with this quote from Gabor Mate. And he says, "The more I assimilate the latest scientific research on human development, the brain, health, and the interconnections between the individual and their social milieu, the greater respect I have for the traditional practices of those we have colonized and whose cultures we did our best to destroy. They had no addictions prior to colonization." Thank you for joining me. I hope you have a great week. Chooch.